Today, I am going to take you through a classroom discussion on language, culture and cognition. Last time, you have seen the relationship between these three, and then you have looked at the details of the relationship between language and culture. Throughout the course, we have been talking about the primacy of language in dealing with everything. That is, in order to define our existence, in order to do everything that we do in our lives, language becomes the primary means of socialization. It is also the primary means of dissemination of knowledge. It is a tool of communication, and then at the same time it has a very complex structure within, and that structure within requires a serious inquiry, and that serious inquiry has applications in solving certain real life issues. So, one of the aspects of language is the relationship between language and culture. Culture is an integrated part of any society. It is the manifestations of the norms in society, and then language plays a very significant role at the periphery, inside, and intersects with these social dimensions in a very significant way. At times we see language encoded in cultural practices. Also, we see certain cultural components being part of linguistic structure of language, that is the internal structure what we were discussing a minute ago. Together they become a very significant part of discussion in the domain of language. So, and this is what we have seen so far in the course, and also last time in particular we have seen the relationship between language and culture. Today, we are going to take you through classroom discussions about these issues, where students are going to be asking questions and also making their short presentations to contextualize their question and understanding of the issues evolving around these terms in understanding the application of the study of language to solving real life issues that we do in applied linguistics. This discussion is also part of an applied linguistics course. So, please go through this discussion and see the kinds of questions and responses and try to relate it with the discussions that we have done so far in general and the discussion that we had last time, that is in the last module in particular. Let us look at the discussion. So, let us get to culture, cognition and society. As there are so many things that we have discussed under these three terms. Okay? And under the term society, we have discussed dialects and variation. We have discussed what mixing of language means to society. We have discussed what is the role of education and nature of education in society. Well, culture is part of the society, but in the overlapping domain of culture and language, we have talked about Spear and Whorf, and how at one point people made an attempt to demonstrate that culture is really part of language. At the same time, people have made efforts to convince that culture is part of language, but definitely not in the way that we think. Language is an autonomous, independent entity. These are the two different domains. Then comes again in the overlapping domain of culture and language comes cognition. Culture itself becomes part of cognition, and as you know, cognitive science is a big domain. not only language, many other aspects of society is part of cognition and cognitive science. So, as part of social cognition in terms of learning and development, lot of things that we have discussed become relevant. So, how what we know as cognition is overlapping with some of the things that we have discussed about language and society are the things what we have done so far. So, let me see what you have to say about an understanding of these things based on whatever we have discussed so far.
A few debates and topics that arise in the intersection of these, the intersection of mainly language, cognition and culture of society.
The revision of our earlier concepts. First, I'll be looking at the linguistic turn in social theory. So everyone begins with socios, so I'll also begin with socios. Between language and culture is something a lot of people have commented on over centuries. But this particular section of the book focuses on people, thinkers and theorists who systematically studied the relationship between language, culture and thought. So one of the first people to do so was Saussure, and Saussure said that language is not a tool we use to express our feelings, but language generates our reality, reflection of what we are trying to say, but it is formed through language. So and then he came up with the ideas of signifier and signified, and then he showed how language is a systematic set of words which make sense only in relation to one another. So the meaning of the word used to signify their relationship is entirely arbitrary, and the word can exist only in a relational hierarchy with other words, and in by itself they make no sense. So the language structures meaning, and so the meaning is formed not through a communication error or an intended way, but this is the inherent logic of language, that it will create meaning. And so would eventually influence the structuralist movement in social theory. So structuralism derives from linguistics and the science of semiotics. So Levi Strauss would draw on this to social structures like kinship and marriage, etc. So he sort of also did the surface structure and deep structure. The surface as expression of a larger social structure. So and then Freud and Lacan would also look at language, the unconscious as structured like the language is structured. And then later thinkers like Gramsci, Althusser and Foucault would extrapolate this idea of structuralism to read ideology like they would language. Okay, this is the social theory aspect of it, but there are thinkers like Vygotsky and Peter Winch who came from a different methodological perspective. Take over. I just like to comment on the difference between social constructivism and social constructionism. So social constructivism is a very early idea. It is sort of similar to symbolic interactionism, and it is an idea which Vygotsky came up with. So Vygotsky said that learning as a process happens through socialization. So learning isn't an innate solitary process where you sit and you learn what is in front of you, but learning can only happen in an environment where you interact with other people around you. So learning is social. So he said, and this is structuralism. So according to Vygotsky, a child's learning will differ depending on the child's environment. So this is how cognitive structures in the child is formed based on his or her socialization. Social constructionism is a much more recent idea which we are, I think, a little more familiar with. Social constructionism is the study of cultural and social artifacts which are created through things like language. So for example, social construct would be something like the idea of femininity. But social constructivism is an entirely, it comes from a different disciplinary background itself.
Do you see resemblance or differences between Chomsky's perspective on learning and Vygotskian perspective on learning?
So Chomsky says that there is already a there's an innate ability to acquire language, but it can happen only with reasonable input. There has to be some kind of input for the output to manifest itself. I don't know if Vygotsky made
But you just said that Vygotsky says almost a similar thing without.
Let's say that, but I don't know if Vygotsky made a statement about our innate ability to.
No, he did not. I can confirm you with that. He did not talk a thing about innate ability. In human beings being born with innate ability is hallmark of Chomskyan theory, is associated with Chomsky in such a sense that nobody wants to own that at all, for a variety of reasons. Okay? That even though Vygotsky does not talk about innate ability, existence of innate ability or language being part of innate ability, he talks about learning and learning from a specific environment. Chomskyan perspective does not deny it, does it? Chomskyan perspective does not deny this part, does it?
But the focus is different.
True, but let us go stepwise. To this far, if we remove innateness, do you see any differences? Chomskyan perspective also says that you can't learn without environment. You can learn only in environment. You can learn only from environment whatever is available. No other kinds of learning takes place without that, right? And then comes the question of input, where he considers that environment responsible for input, right? And then he holds human mind responsible for multiplying that input in a very sophisticated or for some people bizarre way, right? That a lot. But do you see that to some extent there is no deniability about environment and learning? Vygotsky does not talk about innate ability. You wanted to say something.
So I thought in some respects of the thrust of the theory that they are both opposing each other.
That's not true. That's one of the biggest mysteries. Vygotsky is one. There is another name which you don't have here. It's Jean Piaget. Okay, another theorist about learning. And Piaget and Vygotsky do not talk about just language learning. Language becomes part of their discourse on learning. Okay? And to this extent, it is absolutely correct that they do not talk about innate ability. But Jean Piaget and Vygotsky are completely in opposition with Chomskyan perspective is a myth. It's not that. There is a whole debate, it's a decades old debate, it's called Chomsky-Piaget debate. I think people just get fascinated with the name Chomsky-Piaget debate. Debate means two contrastive ideas, two conflicting ideas. I don't know whether it's like the story of English, if it is available on tape or not, but it's definitely in written form. And anybody who wants to read anything about learning, whether it is about artificial intelligence, intelligent machine, or learning in social context, or learning of language, cannot really skip that part of Piaget, Vygotsky and Chomsky. That is kind of Bible. But there aren't serious disagreements among them about learning is the point I am trying to underline.
So from the little that I've been exposed of Vygotsky, he talks about linguistic scaffolding. So he says the basis of a child's language comes from learning through socialization and through adults. But Chomsky is very likely to disagree with it entirely, saying it comes from the faculty of the mind.
No.
The scaffolding for language comes from the faculty of the mind. Chomsky talks about generative rules.
Okay.
That have to do less with what we learn from outside and more with this.
Do people follow this thing? Are you with this? Rule of generative role and role of input. A very simple example can explain it. Can you think of one example?
So, learning plurals in English,
Okay.
say. So, cat and cats. So, what Chomsky would say is you don't learn every word in the lexicon and then as input output and then just produce the output when the situation requires.
Sure.
You learn one example or you get whatever input and then you generate a rule saying the word plus S is plural.
Okay.
So, for him it is the brain that plays a role in making language possible by learning rules. But say Vygotsky might say that you learn the plural or the particular words and languages entirely from your environment.
True.
And his focus is different and
But Vygotskian idea of plurality is what, when he says we learn from environment, what he means is what we call plural is this. This one is not plural. All of that is plural. Is the difference he is making. Vygotsky doesn't say a thing about how, after all, children learn to form plurals. That is, he doesn't talk about how children develop form of language. Understand this part? He doesn't talk about this at all. Whereas, Chomskyan focus is on how children learn the form of the language. Is the difference between the two, which gets translated in variety of ways. Nobody would disagree that children develop learning from environment, right. The debate between them is whether language is responsible for learning, everything that children learn from socialization, or they learn all those things without the background of language as well. The child may not have language, that is fully developed tool to use, and then learn something about society and socialization through that tool. Okay? The child may not have that. Still, children learn lot from socialization in the immediate environment, is the claim of Piaget and Vygotsky both. And they are giving examples for that. Can you quote one or two examples? They may be your examples, not really Vygotsky's examples. Can you give one example, a few examples of what he means or what they mean the children would have learned definitely even if they do not have language fully developed?
things like counting, it seems to precede the learning of language.
Counting?
So children are able to recognize the difference between small numbers.
Okay, something more concrete that will definitely happen before language, and is socialization is definitely responsible for that. Sure.
Children can recognize faces and associated things also.
Children can recognize faces for sure.
Facial expressions.
Facial expression as well.
That has to do with socialization.
Absolutely correct. And this happens much before language develops. Interpretation of facial expressions and recognition of faces would definitely have taken place before the capacity of language develops. Okay? Lot of things like if children touch something warm, they won't touch that again. Would they? If they get hurt, would they touch it again? Most of the time they won't. This happens much before they could say a thing about this experience, right? And you can go on, and more important is you have to watch a child grow. People can write about these things and then you can read, but you just have to watch a child grow. And of course, lot of these things will differ from child to child, right? Not everyone will perform at the same level, but you have to just see that, and you will start believing that what Vygotsky and Piaget are talking about learning definitely cannot be dismissed. But please understand, that talking about language learning is different from talking about learning itself. That is one of the major difference between these people. Now, if you try to draw the circle around language and learning, even in language and learning, so the disagreement between Chomskyan perspective and this psychological perspective is just this much, that they psychologists would want to hold the position that learning takes place independent of language. Okay? Chomskyan perspective simply says language learning takes place in like volcanic eruption. That is what they are talking about, and this is where the rules, the generative rules pop up, they come in, right, for which they have very strong evidence that it is not possible to have learnt every single word one by one, and so on that you have seen. But put these things in proper classification and then there is not confusion at least. And so to again reiterate this part, that Chomskyan perspective on language learning is not necessarily in contradiction with Vygotsky's or Piaget's perspective on learning.
Along the lines of the idea that language is socially constructed came the work of Sapir and Worf. So they postulated three hypotheses. The first one said that the structural differences between language systems will be parallel in general by non-linguistic cognitive differences in the native speakers of the two languages. The second hypothesis said that the structure of anyone's native language will strongly influence or completely determine your worldview as one learns the language. A third hypothesis that was induced by the first two hypotheses was that the semantic systems of different languages may vary without constraint. So the article that Sir circulated by Kay and Kempton, they try to see how the hypothesis holds under different circumstances. So they conducted two experiments to try and see how hypothesis 1 and 3 will hold. So they conducted the experiments between two distinct language linguistic groups. The first one consisted of native speakers of English. The second one consisted of native speakers of Tarahumara, a language from northern Mexico. So the two distinct conclusions that they drew from these experiments were that the first conclusion that they drew that languages differ semantically but not without constraint. And the second conclusion that they drew was linguistic differences may induce non-linguistic cognitive differences between the native speakers, but it's not so absolute that universal cognitive processes cannot be recovered under appropriate contextual conditions.
Moving on from that, I'll actually be talking about a thinker called Robin Lakoff. She spoke about the gendered speech that we have in society, and of particular interest is the hypothesis by Sapir and Worf, which says that language constitutes people's worldviews, right? And so Lakoff said that women are subjugated through their speech, and that their speech constrains their worldview to a particular idea of womanhood that is dictated by patriarchal systems. So women can never escape that system. And also, before I talk about another concept of hers, I'd like to bring in Bernstein. And of course, just to jolt your memories, Labov we've already discussed as the person who did an experiment on the different pronunciations of R, is the experiment that we took care of. And Fisher did an experiment with children on formal and informal speech and different settings in which they come into being. So Bernstein talked about restricted code and elaborated code, and his paper was, as mentioned, was inspired by differences in scholastic achievement between classes. So he said restricted code is mostly available, restricted and elaborated code will be available to the middle classes and the higher classes, while it is mostly restricted code which is available to the lower classes. And restricted code presupposes a certain amount of shared cultural backgrounds and shared information. So it is basically like inside jokes between friends. Inside jokes and friendly conversations would utilize restricted code, and elaborated code would be the kind of language you see in more formal settings, which depends on spelling out everything so that people know what the context is. So and I thought that an application of this when I was reading Lakoff was that Lakoff talks about this thing called the gendered speech and formal speech. So she says that when women, when they are coming from a particular background, they have already been taught to speak in a particular way because of their gender, and this leads to gendered speech. And when they reach a particular level of education, say university, in order to be taken seriously, they have to resort to a more formal speech. And this a sort of code switching that they do between in order that they be taken seriously, takes a toll on their creative energies and thus also affects their performance in academic settings. And this has significant impact and should be looked at in terms of Bernstein's and in fact our society as well. Like when a person who is moving up from restricted code, the example I've chosen is that of women and gendered speech. So when a person who is moving from restricted code and is thrust in fact we've been discussing about this for some time, right? The language barrier that comes up when a person is thrust into education, higher levels of education. And it's similar. A person who just moves up from restricted code into a setting where the code that is expected is an elaborated code, the kind of implications, the kind of consequences that can have on the person's persona, on the person's behavior, and this was widely and in fact restricted code and elaborated code were shown to have wide differences in terms of prestige and academic performances as well.
But that would create a diglossic situation. Have you guys heard about it? Yes. Diglossia, comforts, right? So what's the difference between diglossia and elaborated and restricted code? Not exactly the difference. How would they work?
So when there's, say, taking the case of women in the case of Lakoff, when there's a marked difference between the dialect or the code they're supposed to use in formal settings and the code or the language or the dialect they use in the private settings or informal settings, then for them their language becomes diglossic in the sense that in one setting they use a certain kind and another setting they use a certain kind, and they become quite capable at it after a certain point.
So everybody is capable of using diglossic language because, right? Because why? I mean, nobody can say that no, I only know one way of using language, right? And that also we have to talk about only when we want to talk about them. It is such a common thing in human life that we don't even need to talk about it. It depends on nothing. All kinds of categories that you may have seen, classifications across social structure or economic structure or educational structure or gender or anything. It's above everything. That is, the ability to use diglossic, ability to negotiate between diglossic situations is normal. I don't want to use the word innate, is normal because
I also happen to come across this other theoretical concept called communities of practice, which is used to refer to people who share a common goal or objective and they work towards it. And the thing between and we can apply this to language speaking. And the thing is, there are no defined boundaries between different communities of practice when it comes to language speaking. And we've discussed this when we come to the concept of contiguous areas in language speaking. and how there are no defined areas and boundaries, right? Linguistic areas. So because of the fact that people move between these communities and practices, I think it contributes to the fact that they have to negotiate between certain languages and they borrow.
You are defining what enables diglossic situation, right? But it's much simpler than that. True, that part is true, but it's much simpler than that in the sense that the whole the idea of diglossia is not dependent on language, it's dependent on situation. So the idea of diglossia is not linguistic, right? We are all in different kinds of situations. Can we say that we are all, or I can only be in one situation all the time? This is not even thinkable, right? So if definitely the language that we are using right now is neither my language nor your language, right? And we don't even want to know those, right? And I mean we do, but only when you interact with people in different domains, right? You don't interact with me in certain domains, therefore you don't know the language or the variety I use in that domain. The whole idea, the simple point is, the whole idea of diglossia is situational, right? Therefore, everybody must have this capacity to negotiate and navigate through diglossic situation. Does this make us multilingual?
When from restricted code to elaborate code setting, would you consider from one restricted code to another restricted code? That will be a far more complicated job linguistically. I think academic setting, from going from a non-academic setting to an academic setting is not probably from one restricted code to another restricted code than restricted code to elaborate code.
But the thing is, it's a bit difficult to define the kind of code that academic settings use, right? Because at the same time, it makes sense to call it restricted code, but at the same time, it also follows the rules of elaborated code in that it believes in spelling out everything, it believes in providing context for every bit of situation that it comes through, and I mean, it's a bit of a gray area, right? Because when we are talking about something like, even in this class, when we are talking about all this, and when I just mention Fisher and Labov casually and do not talk about their experiments, it is presupposing knowledge and it is probably going to be classified as restricted code rather than elaborated code.
When we talk about diglossia and did not, like we just said, oh yeah, you know diglossia. We did not go into explaining the context of what diglossia is, what came from and all that. So that makes it academic setting a restricted code.
Absolutely.
From one restricted code to another restricted code, I think it will be a cognitive leap.
Absolutely. So basically you are saying there is no clear distinction between these things.
Yeah.
We can't categorize one as A and something else as B. Absolutely correct.
We had this Sapir-Whorf hypothesis also, that they were at one point later research was talking about how codes are different, and then maybe that is how thought differs.
Absolutely.
And then we thought, oh wait, the code differentiation between codes is also so complicated that you can't really differentiate.
And at the end of all these, so that is true. At the end of all these things, you have to ask this question to yourself: why are we talking about these things? Because we want to understand that what we know as language and what we know as use of language is not homogeneous activity, is the precise point, right? It can be said in one sentence, but all these things, terms, discussions make you believe that, and therefore we reach to a much bigger dilemma that we still want to believe that we speak a language.
The problem is, the question is not that if whether it is a language or many languages.
Right.
We just want to know the nature of
Absolutely true.
what we are doing.
As long as we keep talking about names and a language, the idea of a language with many things, the idea of purity, the idea of social identity with that, the idea of ego associated with language, supremacy associated with language. As long as we keep talking about these things, The point is, we do not really pay much attention to the ground reality and actual nature of language, is the point that we are trying to say. An understanding of these things not only provides you cognitive flexibility, but also enables you with social tolerance, larger social tolerance. It is not accommodating another community with the other one, but it makes you so flexible cognitively that the tolerance becomes much bigger. And then we see, so there is a direct correlation between nature of language and all these things on the other side, is why we are discussing this part.
Over from what we'll be discussing on the social constructivist and constructionist idea about the language, or about what Sapir and Wolf talk about the how language constitute one's worldview. Now, why this kind of an understanding of the language, that the grammar of the language that you speak will reflect your worldview, why it is problematic is because it will raise questions, very important questions regarding, say, language and cognition. How this is going to affect a person's scholastic achievements, his cognitive flexibility. So if you say things like, for example, say if you're saying to a person that, oh, you're going to learn a new language, does that mean that the person is going to have a totally different worldview from what he already has? And if that's what you believe, then it leads to the situations of social identity, where you might have a less prestigious identity, or the very process of that will lead to pitting language against each other, where different languages come under hierarchies, one language being more prestigious than the other, and which in totality will lead to the cognitive ability of the person, the questioning of the cognitive ability of the person as such. When you have that sort of an understanding, what happens is you're completely eliminating the the principles aspect of the language, that every languages do have things in common. So hence making an argument that a new language will give you a totally different worldview of the society or the world would be slightly far-fetched. And this is where we understand that multilingualism comes to it. This can be, the response to this can be multilingualism, that it is not possible for anyone to speak, say, one language, because we have already discussed that languages have porous boundaries. You can have a community around a language, but then no community will have there will be no community which would speak just one language. So multilingualism again will have, when you understand multilingualism, then this can explain you the effects this can have on the cognitive ability of the people. Like, then it becomes important to look at scholastic achievements and social tolerance and cognitive flexibility. And there are many researches that have been conducted on this, and which prove that multilingualism will it does prove better in cases of scholastic achievements and cognitive flexibility.
Just imagine a situation, just taking a small detour, when you only have capacity to deal with one situation, right? That is, you can only use formal language. How will the life be? Right? But you just try to imagine someone else's life, if it is hard to imagine your own. How the person is going to sound if you know only one situation, one variety, one type of language, one style, that is either informal or formal, right? If I know only informal language that I use, I don't think I can sustain here for 5 minutes. This system will not let me use the language that I speak otherwise, okay, in variety of ways, okay. Some of them will not be acceptable morally, some of them will not be acceptable ethically, some of it will not be acceptable cognitively. I may speak anything you may not understand that, then communication breaks down. I may speak something which is highly objectionable and it's possible that I do not mean that, but then that will be barred from that sort of usage at moral and ethical grounds. The point is, if I just know one type, or reverse the situation, I only talk the way I talk in class, right? There will be no better, as he said, monotonous person than me or you if you just do this much, right? You talk to your friends, you start talking the way you make a presentation or you speak in a class, people will run away from you. The world will be a very different thing if everybody had just that much of capacity. The world will be very different place. But in the world when everybody else can do everything the way people usually do, just imagine yourself doing this way, just one. Understand this thing? It will be very bad, it will look very odd, I do not know what to do with it, right. Why am I talking about that? That example is because the fact that we are not like that explains multilingualism. The way I just described is the definition of multilingualism. So, diglossia, varieties, dialects, different kinds of situations, formal, informal distinction, all of them are part of multilinguality. Multilingualism as definition is not 1 plus 2 plus 3. Therefore, languages are fluid systems, not really countable entities, and that guarantees social tolerance, that guarantees our flexibility, and therefore, it is assumed, not assumed, it has been shown, but we can assume for the time being that such a situation will guarantee higher scholastic achievement. That is a different story altogether, but for us, for today, for us to see, the point is that is what language is. So, we are not trying to define, if we say I want to define language as multilingualism, in fact we are putting it the other way around. We are talking about multilingualism and then we want to see that as language. That is a different story altogether, right. And this is significant, I am not trying to dismiss that. Please understand the contribution of William Labov, that this person is still alive, contribution of William Labov in taking the entire discipline seriously is very serious, very serious. I'll tell you just logistics part of it. You do not have to deal with this thing, but in an independent course on, let us say, MA in linguistics, this is not how courses are catered, where everything is part of the same course. Okay? There are courses on phonetics, phonology, morphology, syntax, pragmatics, semantics, sociolinguistics and applied linguistics and all that. 7, 8 of these things put together in a year. I am not talking about 5 years program, because I do not know how to design that one. 2 years, I have not gone through that, so I will not know that. So, a 2 years program is made this way, 8 courses put together or 12 courses put together in 2 semesters, 4 semesters or 3 trimesters, depending upon the system. You are catered introductory ideas of these things and then you are given a degree of MA in linguistics, all right. In such a situation, people will usually people will try to avoid technical stuff and want to talk about general discussions about language, which was part of sociolinguistics. And it led to the point when people started talking about the sociolinguistics, I think I have told you this thing, is sociolinguistics. However, it is completely misconstrued idea, because, and this is what William Labov has shown, that you cannot get to a social variable without understanding basics of phonetics and phonology. You cannot really put your fingers on how languages differ from one another and how varieties are either connected with the other one or leaps into another one without understanding syntactic details of those varieties. Therefore, it became imperative that to do a better kind of sociolinguistics, you must know good syntax and good phonology both, and of course, morphology. And rest of the things are not excluded from that. If you do not understand how meaning is made out of language, which is part of semantics. The point is, the better you knew everything else, the better sociolinguist or applied linguist you are. That was the idea. This idea was reversed single-handedly by William Lebov. Before that, people do not take these things very seriously, and he has shown how to trap and capture ongoing variation in language, and that has changed lot of things, beginning from the definition of mother tongue and the entire discourse on whether or not mother tongue is even a relevant idea to talk about. I have mother tongue, what is my mother tongue? The point is, their theoretical contributions are good, but at the same time an outcome of those, of understanding of theoretical contributions of these people is relevant for making us see language as empirical fact.
So far what we've been talking about is, the area we've looked at is how language and culture and social variables interact with each other. But now we move on to a different set of theorists who look at from a slightly different point of view. That is, they look at how language is processed within the brain. And if they are looking at society and culture, it will be as a variable that's involved in the process. So the perspective shifts and the techniques used also shift. You will see that neuro-linguistics comes in, or cognitive psychology comes in, so the methods differ from, say, ethnography or controlled behavioral experiments.
When we talk about all these specific differences that we want to see in languages that may be or may not be, coded into them culturally, and we want to assert this opposite relation between culture and language, but this in cognitive sciences the emphasis is always on from language to cognition. How may language shape cognition? And there are basically two approaches, and the first one is the popular one, where they look at, neuroscience looks at cognitive abilities as modular entities. Like they trace it's an interdisciplinary thing with neuroscience and evolutionary biology, and they trace modules within the brain that no doubt have, we do not know conclusively that the brain behaves as an organic whole, especially in terms of processing language. We just know that there are parts that deal with sensory motor things and there are parts that deal with vision, but we don't know if these are not simply functionally located or are actually attached to this faculty that we have called language. And so in theory, where these things meet, language, cognition and neurobiological factors meet, is to see if cognitive science can encompass all of human abilities, including language. And the trends that we can see in the history of this, it's a very new field because most of the rigorous testing and methodology on this field is through computers and algorithms. So it's a relatively new field on which initially they would post Chomskyan turn, there would be experiments that could demonstrate how a child may acquire something like past tense, and these would be the the main thing, the difference between a generative version of this and a computer version of this is that the generative version thinks of, say, the plural form as representational, but in an
So basically what you are saying is it's an understanding of language in generative terms is what makes language different from other kinds of learning,
yes,
right?
yes.
Can you give one example other than plural formation? Please understand that it was generative explanation which was missing before when language was called human behavior, when language was part of all other learning. So, only generative explanation that was added made it different from other kinds of learning, and it is powerful enough to dismiss that. So, what is that generative understanding of language? I am asking you to give one example.
I was trying to contrast it with the methodology of that the neuro-linguist and
That is fine.
yeah. So, but what I think would be the reason for differentiating it is that these models, I mean, there is some, like, a child is capable of, you know, taking in lesser than, you know, what he is going to acquire and, you know, work with it.
Say it again. Child is
Like
capable
his-
of taking
his
lesser.
the form of his language, he is capable of completing it in a generative way, which is by taking limited inputs and not a full-fledged, like as opposed to the program.
You see, hold on. There is one more thing which we should understand with clarity. Whether we talk about language as behavior, or we talk about, or we explain language learning from generative perspective, people learnt or acquired language the same way all the time. It was only theoretical explanations which were added time to time. People did not change themselves, nothing happened to people. Our understanding of how this happens has only changed for better or worse. For example, people learned past tense all the time the same way, but generative theory explained it that we extract rules of past tense first from limited input, and this is the role of limited, this is where the role of limited input is restricted. That extraction of something in form of what constitutes knowledge of language takes place from a very limited input, and then we apply it, is generative process. Application becomes generative process, which enables us to multiply things in wide output, much bigger output, which is why generative capacity is responsible for larger output. Acquisition or learning of past tense, or acquisition or learning of anything, an explanation of that from generative perspective will make language different from all other methodological approaches, whether it is neural cognition, neuropsychology, or neuroscience itself. Understand this thing? Or psychological methods of explaining language learning, where it was done from stimulus and response theory.
So basically, try to go over the different related concepts in this entire complex of language, cognition, and society. So there are theories that are placed in different parts in the spectrum. They are dealing with a lot of interconnected concepts. For example, one theorist, Carruthers, tries to come up with a reconciliatory thing. He says, well, language and cognition are definitely dependent upon each other, but to what extent is the main question. And he says it's not as much as, say, the social constructivist thing, and he resorts to cognitive psychology and the experiments performed under it to give proof otherwise. So one idea that he comes up with is that language is used as a heuristic. So language is like a code, say when you write a post-it note to remember, something like that. So the sentence, okay, I have to go left, is stored in the brain, and then when the action has to be done later, it is recovered. He also talks about the dual systems theory, where he says that the linguistic faculty is an evolved system from earlier faculties like I don't know, motion or other cognitive systems. And he says that because it's an evolved version, it's not entirely, they're not disconnected, but they are also different. So that's one way in which he's trying to say how they're associated with each other.
That's all. Shall we stop then here?